Thanks, everybody, for attending another presentation on Florida's Way of Water. Our speaker this morning is Ryan Smart, who has served as the first executive director of the Florida Springs Council since 2018. In 2017, he was honored as the Bob Graham Center Young Floridian of the Year. Yay! Out of 22 million people. After serving as the director of the Florida Conservation Coalition and the president of 1,000 Friends of Florida. The goal of Ryan and the Florida Springs Council Board of Directors is to build the power, influence, and resources of Springs advocates across Florida. They will do whatever is feasible to stop and reverse the destruction of North Florida's springs and waters. Florida Springs Council lobbies in Tallahassee for better laws and regulations to improve and protect the springs and the aquifers that support them, and coordinates legal challenges to agencies and other entities that do not follow or fulfill the law. Ryan earned a master's degree in water policy and public administration from the University of Florida, and it must have been somewhat after I finished my degree in water resource economics, because so far as I knew, there was no program in water policy, unfortunately. Okay, carry on, Ryan.
Thank you. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. I actually built my own program in water policy, so the school was nice enough to let me do what I wanted. Thank you all for having me here today. How's that? Can you all hear me? All right, good. Thank you all for having me here today. How many of you saw the presentation last week by Casey and Phyllis? Most of you? All right, good stuff. So, saw their presentation. They talked a lot about, trying to get the balance right, okay. They talked a lot about kind of how our state agencies have gone wrong. What kind of changes have happened over the last 20 years that has degraded those state agencies. So today I thought that I would look at kind of the impact of what that degradation has done in real terms on some of the laws and rules that have been passed by the legislature and now need to be enacted by our state agencies. So we're going to go back a little bit. We're going to talk about some legislation that passed, and then we're going to follow that legislation forward, which is eventually going to end up into the legal work that the Florida Springs Council does, which is really what makes us It was working earlier, I swear. There we go. Really kind of what makes our group unique is that we're willing to take these legal challenges, take them all the way through the courts, District Court of Appeals, and prevail to lead to better water laws. So for 2014, 2015, and 2016 was when I had first started lobbying in the legislature, and we had a bipartisan group of 5 senators, Senator Dean, Simpson, Simmons, Monford, and I'm forgetting someone. But they just said they wanted to do something for springs. We had had some really big springs events. We had had the first big algae bloom. There was the algae bloom in the St. Johns River. There was a lot of attention in springs. There hadn't been major water legislation in the state of Florida, at least that increased protections in a very long time. So we worked on that bill for 3 years. It ended up passing in 2016. It was the most debated, most fought over legislation that I've seen in the 11 years that I've been working in the Capitol on lobbying. And there was a lot of compromises, and you kind of know we ended up somewhere near where we should have been because everyone hated the bill when they passed it. Environmentalists didn't like it, industry groups didn't like it, no one liked it. So it was probably a pretty good mix. And I'm going to talk about 2 things that we got out of that bill in law that were very important at the time. And this is the first one. This is the Florida Springs and Aquifer Protection Act Basin Management Action Plans. All basin management action plans is water quality restoration plans. So if you've got a water that's impaired because it has too much pollution, a basin management action plan is the state's plan to take that water from being impaired and to make it clean again. And it's the only regulatory tool we have in the state of Florida to fix impaired waters. So these are very important. And they weren't effective. They didn't have goals, they didn't have requirements, they didn't have deadlines. They really weren't designed to do the job. So the legislature, DEP, environmentalist, industry groups got together and they said, we're going to write a new basin management action plan and we're going to apply it to 30 outstanding Florida springs. So these are the famous springs that everyone's heard of: Rainbow, Silver, Wekiva, Wakala, Volusia Blue, Manatee, Ichetucknee. These are the big 30 springs, the first magnitudes plus a couple second magnitudes that were in important legislative districts. And there's a few things that these BMAPs now had to include. They had to include a list of all the projects necessary to achieve the water quality goal. They had to have a plan to achieve that water quality goal within 20 years. And they had to assign the pollutant load to various types of sources. So they had to say, okay, agriculture, you need to cut back this much. Septic tank pollution needs to cut back this much. Urban fertilizer needs to cut back this much. And then there was some minor regulatory parts, prohibiting new septic tanks on small lots very close to springs, requiring advanced wastewater treatment near our springs for wastewater treatment facilities, getting rid of things like toxic waste storage and things that never should have been near our drinking water sources in the first place. So it had a few prohibitions, but mostly it is what it says. It's a basin management action plan. So it's a plan to take you from dirty water to clean water. And the hard work really isn't making the plan. The hard work is implementing it, right? It's just like anything else you want to do. You want to build a house. Well, it takes some work to have the plan to build the house, but building the house is the hard part. If we want to take a road trip to Seattle, it takes some planning, but it's not, the actual drive there is what's going to be hard. So we were very hopeful that we could get this part done. So these are the areas that are covered by the outstanding Florida Springs BMAP. So everything you see in green or yellow is subject to one of these plans. So you can see it's a very large portion of Central and North Florida. And you can see a whole list of the springs there. So, Alachua is kind of carved out a little bit between the Santa Fe BMAP and the Rainbow Silver BMAPs, but obviously what we do in Gainesville here affects that Santa Fe River BMAP and flow in the Santa Fe River and everything else. So first, let's talk about what they found. So when they decided that they were going to do these BMAPs, the first thing they had to figure out was which of these 30 outstanding Florida springs are polluted, because you can't have a plan without first acknowledging that the spring is polluted. So they looked at all 30 springs. They found that 24% or 24 of the 30 outstanding Florida springs were polluted by too much nitrogen. So that's 80%. And if you look kind of around water in general, that's a number that seems to appear a lot. About 80% of our lakes are polluted, 80% of our springs are polluted, our rivers, and that's really geographical, but that tends to be about where we're at. So when you lump all of those 24 outstanding Florida springs, and they look at what the actual sources of pollution are, how much of it's coming from agriculture, how much of it's coming from septic tanks, how much of it's coming from urban fertilizer. And if you listen to the news or the legislature, you'd probably think that septic tanks were by far our biggest source of pollution, but they're not. Agriculture is responsible for 70% of all the pollution entering outstanding Florida springs, right? So you can take all the other pollution sources, add them all up together, double it, and it's still not as much pollution as coming into our springs from agriculture. The agricultural loading to just the Suwannee Basin is estimated about 5 million pounds per year, which, you hear a lot about the loading into the Everglades. This is comparable what we're putting into the Suwannee River from agriculture. Septic tanks are a distant second at 14.8%, so just about 15%. And then urban fertilizer, which is really the easiest thing for us to address, which you don't hear a lot about, is 12%. Wastewater treatment is 2.8%, and drainage wells are a minuscule 0.1%. Why is wastewater treatment so much less than septic tanks? Well, the effluent coming out of the septic tank is averaged about 60 milligrams per liter nitrogen, 60. When it goes through a wastewater treatment facility, especially one that has, additional filtering through wetlands or advanced wastewater treatment inside the factory, we get that down to under 3 milligrams per liter. So there's a huge difference between a septic tank and someone who's hooked up to central sewer and the amount of loading that that would be going on. And that's why you see such a big difference between septic systems and wastewater. But it varies by spring shed, right? That's a snapshot of the whole state. But if you look at individual spring sheds, you'll see that it varies quite differently. So I was talking about the Sewanee Springs. 85% of the nitrogen in that area is coming from agriculture, right? So you could pretty much, eliminate all other human impacts and you would still have a significantly impaired spring sheds just from agriculture. Septic systems are only 3.1, urban fertilizer is only 3.1. So here, it's primarily agriculture. If you go over to Volusia Blue, septic tanks are 57%, urban fertilizer is 27%. Agriculture is the opposite, down to 3%. Right, so why is that? Well, it's the land use, right? How you use the land is going to determine where the pollution's coming from. So up in the Sewanee Basin, it's a primarily agricultural economy. Most of the land there is in row crops or cattle. And for that reason, you have a lot of agricultural loading. You go down into Volusia by Daytona, you have subdivisions, right? All we have grown down there is subdivisions. A lot of them were put in on septic tanks before we knew any better. So in that area, you have 57%. And then you add in all those subdivisions, they all want a pretty green yard. So then they add their yard fertilizer and you end up with a wild number of 27% for yard fertilizer. Because where they are, you put the fertilizer, where we are too, right? Anybody over here, you put the fertilizer on the ground, the rain comes, that nitrogen is going straight into the aquifer. Your plants can't get it fast enough, right? They just can't. So, even if you do everything you can and you use slow release and you don't do it during rainy season, you're still going to contribute some nitrogen. But down there's obviously a major problem. And of course, what we need to do to address these two spring systems is very different, right? Very, very different. So the Basin Management Action Plans actually went into effect in 2018. And like I said, the DEP in the law has 20 years to accomplish the water quality goal. So they set goals for themselves, which they were required to. They needed to reduce nitrogen by 30% in the first 5 years, 80% over the first 10 years, and 100% over 15, which gives them 5-year window to fix any mistakes that they made. Those are the goals set by them. So when we saw the Basin Management Action Plans that came out from the department, we grew concerned because they didn't do those 3 things that I talked about on the first slide. They didn't have all the projects that they needed. They didn't have a plan to meet the water quality goal within 20 years, and they didn't tell anybody how much they had to reduce by. They just said, this is the loading and we'll get it down. So we were very critical from the jump that these plans were not going to work. And not only were they not going to meet their 30% goal, but that they wouldn't even bring things in the right direction. Well, despite a legal requirement to do it, one of the many things the Department of Environmental Protection does not do is provide water quality data. They have to publish a legislatively mandated annual report every year about their progress in restoring springs health. I think any logical person would think that you would want to show how water quality has changed over time. That is not what they want to show. Instead, they show the amount of money they've spent and the number of projects that they've completed, with no information on the efficacy of those projects or that money. So, anyone who's ever been in business, if you can imagine going into a meeting and sitting down with one of your employees and them bragging that they spent a ton of money but can't show you what they did with it, that's essentially what our state likes to do. And if you hear anybody in the legislature talk and you ask them, what are you doing on water quality? I will bet you everything in my wallet that they will tell you how much money they've spent, and they will never tell you what that money's actually doing. Well, if you dig into the project of efficiency numbers that are hidden in a spreadsheet in the back, and these aren't actual numbers, these are just DEP's estimates. So let's say that, we'll give DEP all the credit in the world that their estimates are accurate. They're removing 1 pound of nitrogen per year for every $2,000 they spend. It takes a farmer about $6 to put that pound of nitrogen into the ground. So the inefficiency there is outrageous. And looking at that, we said, well, this data is publicly available. So we did a public records request. We got all of the water quality data from 2018 to now. We gave it to our friends at the Florida Springs Institute. I think Dr. Knight has been here or will be here, and to analyze, because they're the data guys. And they came up with these charts. And what we found was that for most of the outstanding Florida Springs BMAPs, water quality has gotten worse. It's gotten worse overall at about 24% from before that they passed the Basin Management Action Plan. So they set a legal goal of reducing it by 30%. We're now 4 years in, and it's actually gone up by 24%. And of course, it varies. There's a couple springs that have gone down in nitrogen a little bit, but again, the trend line is 24% positive, and these are the ones that came back with a significant increase. And if you look, you can see these are almost all springs that are dominated by agriculture. And what we saw was that because most of the money is going into septic and wastewater, we're seeing some slowing in the increase in those springs, but the ones where there's agriculture, which the BMAPs did essentially nothing about, we're continuing to see those go up in pretty significant numbers. So this is the overall chart for all of the implemented BMAPs. And again, that's about a 24% increase. So that green line is the water quality goal. That's where we need to get to. And you can see that red line is when the BMAPs were passed, and things have increased significantly in that time. And we didn't know if they'd be able to achieve the decrease because there is some legacy nitrogen in the aquifer, but you definitely should not be seeing a significant increase if these plans are going to work. So given that we thought these plans did not meet the minimum requirements of law, way back in 2019, we began complaining that this reality that I just explained to you was what was going to happen. If DEP put these plans in place, the springs would continue to get worse. So we did something no one's ever done before. We've challenged these water quality plans in court. We were a very young group. I took over in November of 2018, and we filed this challenge in January of 2019. So we had one employee, no members, and a few bucks in the bank. And we decided we're going to take on the state in this Herculean effort. So we went to the only place we can. We went to our member groups, and we said, hey, we can't do this without y'all. So we got groups like Rainbow River Conservation and Silver Springs Alliance and Friends of Wekiva River and our Santa Fe River and Ichetucknee Alliance, all these great groups to come in and essentially be the petitioners because we didn't have standing at that point. So they each filed individual challenges, and we recruited the legal team. And that's really what made the difference from previous organizations that I've worked for is, we really go all out. We're not just trying to file a challenge, but we want to win a challenge. We want more lawyers than they have. I was in way too many cases early in my career where there was one lawyer against four, and you're just not going to win that way. So we put significant resources into this challenge, and we challenged it on those exact things that I was talking about. They weren't going to meet the water quality goal. They didn't allocate the pollutant load. They didn't use every tool that they had available. There were some things that even though they weren't going to meet the water quality goal, they left on the shelf. And I think one of the things that was most disappointing to me and really shows the decline in the agency is in our discovery, we asked for all of the draft basin management action plans that they created. And we got them, and they were better. A lot of the things that were required in the law at one point were in the basin management action plans and then were actually removed under political pressure. Right. And it's not necessarily the fault of that DEP employee, but somewhere down the line, someone said, don't do this. And what's so disappointing is we spent 3 years fighting over this bill with DEP and the polluters and industry groups and everybody else. That was the time. If you can't do 20 years, you need to get up in front of the legislature and say, we can't do 20 years. Or if there's a plan, and we spent 3 years going over every word of this bill, and then they feel like they can just ignore the law. So we went to a hearing at the Division of Administrative Hearings. We lost that. It was the longest time between a hearing and a decision of any case ever. Then we went to the First District Court of Appeals. And at the First District Court of Appeals, we actually prevailed. So the first DCA invalidated the basin management action plans for 14 of the 24 impaired outstanding Florida springs, and told DEP that they have to go back in and do the allocations, which was our number one thing, because the allocations are how you get to responsibility. If you just say, hey, we all got to save $1,000, come back in 2 weeks, right? You have to tell people what they have to do. You have to actually say and set a goal, because the fact is, for things like agriculture, we have no way to meet those goals. And we have to confront that reality. And the only way we're going to do that is by putting a goal in place and seeing it not being met. And that's when we're going to realize that we need to do more with best management practices, more with land conservation, It's an unfortunate reality that the Santa Fe Suwannee area is not a great place for row crops, even though that's what we have. The soil for it is terrible, right? So when you put the nitrogen down, so much of it is in the aquifer because we don't have the soil to soak up that nitrogen. So you're losing way more. They project you're losing 3 or 4 times more nitrogen up in this area than you are when they do farming in other areas. Especially the very nitrogen intensive farming like tomatoes and corn that really require a bunch of nitrogen and a bunch of water and are very harmful to the environment. So our legal team said this is the biggest environmental win in court in 20 years. We are waiting for DEP to adopt and publish the new draft basin management action plans. They'll actually have to adhere to the law. It's been 3 months and they haven't made any progress, so we'll probably end up having to sue them again with a writ of mandamus to force them to initiate the rulemaking to put the BMAPs back in place. When we were in court for those 2 weeks, it's really kind of sad because we have a bunch of citizens over here paying for lawyers and experts to challenge the State Department of Environmental Protection. And then all of our tax money is also paying all of their lawyers and experts to say, no, polluters should be able to continue to pollute. And we gave DEP chance after chance after chance to just follow the law. And again, we're not trying to shut down a permit on this one. We're not trying to stop any operator. This is just to make a plan. And because DEP was so upset or so concerned about upsetting their constituents, which at this point are the polluters and the water users and the wetland folks who are coming in for permits, because it's the regulated industries that they see as their constituents, they weren't willing to even put anything in a plan that would upset those folks. And because of that, 7 nonprofits and 4 individuals had to spend 4 years and hundreds of thousands of dollars in court just to get the state to make a plan that followed the law. Same bill. This was the other thing we were very excited to get. This was probably the biggest thing that we got out of the bill, which said that the water management districts were no longer allowed to give out consumptive use permits, right? That's a permit to use a large amount of water to any permit that would harm springs, the outstanding Florida springs. And that's super important because a lot of our springs are already suffering significant harm or on track to suffer significant harm within 20 years. So if the Department of Environmental Protection followed this law and actually adopted rules that prevented withdrawals that are harmful, you would begin to see consumptive use permits get denied. Right now, even though it's well known that our spring and river flows are down about 30% over the last 4 years, even though we're seeing we're seeing the impacts of those reduced flows all over the state, 99% of the water use permits that have been given to the districts over the last 10 years have been approved. 99%. Right. So when you have a permitting system, for it to work, there actually has to be some permits denied, or you really don't have a permitting system at all. You just have a guaranteed approval, right? It's just check the box. So this was an incredibly important rule. This was passed in 2016. At the same time this was passed around about, you had another rule that said the Department of Environmental Protection had to do a consistency effort to streamline permitting. There was something called the Central Florida Water Initiative, which was a massive effort to find hundreds of millions of gallons a day of water so that developers near Volusia, Orange, Seminole counties could build one of the largest developments in Florida. You've had the state take over wetlands permitting from the federal government to make it easier to do dredge and fill wetlands. All of those things have happened. They've never even started the process of adopting this rule. So 7 years after this was passed, they have done nothing to adopt the rule, and the legislature won't force them to, right? One of the negative consequences of term limits is that no one who was around for this bill is still in the legislature. So there's no one who has any kind of stake. This is no one's legacy. And, we actually have Senator Simmons, who's a very, very brilliant Republican lawyer out of Orlando. He's come out on the record, written letters to DEP, to Governor Scott, talked to the newspapers, He wrote this bill. He says they're not implementing it correctly. They ignore him. And he was the Senate president pro tempore just 3 years ago. But, once they're out of that building, they really, all of their cachet is just gone. So we have no one left who believes that this law actually needs to be enforced. So this is what they've done on the law. They have delayed it. There, in March of last year, we threatened to sue them. So they said, okay, we'll publish a law. I kid you not, they published the exact same law that was in effect the exact same rule that was in effect when the law was passed. They added one difference to deal with agricultural worker hand washing. And they said, well, there's your new rule. And we said, well, no, that's actually not a new rule. That's the same old rule. So again, we threatened to sue them and they withdrew it. And now just on March 30th of this year, they published their, 8th notice of a year delay in adopting this rule. And again, they've had plenty of time, money. This isn't a resource problem. They've had the resources to do everything they've wanted to do. They just have no desire to do this. And will probably be our next legal action. Will be forcing them to actually do rulemaking on this rule. But before that, it's a weird slide. We are challenging a permit that is a direct result of that rule not being passed. So there's quite a Jenny Springs up north of here has a consumptive use permit to pump water and sell it to a company called Blue Trident that used to be Nestle Waters North America. It's a very controversial permit, and it's a very controversial permit for a few reasons. One, it's going to triple pumping out of the spring. It's only 1 million gallons a day, people will say. It's a tiny, tiny percentage of water. But because it comes directly out of the spring, it has an oversized impact compared to other withdrawals. So a few years ago, we got a law that made the Department of Environmental Protection write a report on spring water bottling. And they looked at the Jenny Springs permit specifically. And they found that when this permit is pumping at full capacity of 1 million gallons a day, it will have twice the drawdown at Jenny Springs of every other permit combined in the basin. And that's simply because of how close it is to the spring. Right? If you go pump 7-8 miles away, you're going to have a much more diffused effect than when you pump right by the spring. And why do they want to pump by the spring? Because then they can slap that fancy spring water, right? And what they've found is that, they've basically tricked people into believing that spring water is healthier than bottled water, and that bottled water is healthier than your tap water, with a filter. So they can, there's a slight increase in demand and they can charge a slight premium. And for that, they're doing about 600 times the damage to the water resources than if they just move those wells a few miles away. Second, the Santa Fe River is one of the very few rivers in Florida that is already experiencing significant harm from overpumping, right? And that's not my determination. The state of Florida has something called a minimum flow and level, and this spring is already suffering significant harm. That means that you have animals that cannot pass because of how low the water level is. That means that you have increased nitrogen concentrations to the point where you're getting significant algae outbreaks. That means you're losing opportunities for human recreation, right? So this is kind of the point where we've already gone past where we can go ecologically and we have to get better. Well, no one should be able to triple their pumping at a time when everyone needs to be cutting back, especially a company where such little of that value is coming back to the community. And so, basically all of the profits from that are going to a hedge fund. There's a couple dozen employees who don't do very well. I mean, they do fine, but it's not like this is creating wealth for that community. Instead, what they're doing is they're taking our tax dollars to pay for alternative water supply projects to make up for the harm being done by private corporations that are pumping. So one of the crazy ideas that surfaced last year is to spend $500,000 in taxpayer dollars to run a pipe to the Suwannee River, pipe the water all the way back to the Ichetucknee, build a wastewater treatment plant in the woods, clean that water because it's too dirty in the Suwannee just to be put down on the ground, and then put it into a forest, right? And they would rather plan that than just tell a company like Nestle or tell all of us really that we have to cut back on our pumping and use less water. Second reason we challenged the permit was that the bottling company was not on the permit, right? So whoever uses the water has to be on the permit. The water user is the one who puts it in the bottle. Nestle refused to come on the permit, which means that there's no oversight of what happens at the plant. If you're not on the permit, the district can't enforce the rules. And then the third reason, and the most important one to us, is that the permit's clearly not consistent with the public interest. Water in Florida is held in public trust for our benefit. So every consumptive use permit, every permit to withdraw a large amount of water has to be consistent with the public interest. This permit is clearly not. And in this case, we had over 19,000 people write to the Suwannee River Water Management District and tell them that they objected to issuing this permit. And the district went ahead and issued it anyways. So we have taken Seven Springs Nestle to court. They have used their significant resources to delay and slow us down and do everything they can. They got the case kicked out of court at one point. We appealed to the First District Court of Appeals, where we won another unanimous verdict. And now we are set to go to hearing in Tallahassee on that May 10th through the 12th. And, you know, we hope we'll be successful in this one too. And this is about way more than just stopping one permit. I mean, the public, you know, like I said before, 99% of these permits are being approved. And if the public's interest in these permits was actually being considered, that would never be the case. You know, so we're intentionally taking on a permit that we feel is the best possible example of a permit that's not in the public's interest, you know, but also taking on a major corporation to kind of try to send a message across the state that we're going to not only take out these permits, but eventually we're going to take out the rules. And we're going to force, I mean, the law says the permit has to be in the public interest. The Suwannee River Water Management District actually has a definition: the interests and concerns of the people of the community and the residents of the district and state. 19,000 people wrote in to express their interests and concerns. And, you know, one permit reviewer at the district decided that he knew better what was in the public's interest. And we're in the middle of discovery in this case. And it's really interesting because we asked them, you know, well, how did you determine what the public's interest is? And essentially what they said is, well, there's a demand for bottled water and these people have a factory to put it in a bottle. And it was like, so, you know, they are really defining public interest as, can you make money off of water, right? And if we continue to define public interest as, can you make money off of water, while we continue to give that water away for free, right? The company here paid $115 permit to pump 1 million gallons a day for 5 years. So, you know, you can kind of do the math, 365 million gallons, let's say 300 million end up in bottles. You guys know what a bottle of water goes for, right? Put that over 5 years, right? You're talking billions. And they $115 to get that permit. And then they want us to pay $500 million to undo the damage that permits like that cause. A lot of people want to know what they can do. I've got 2 messages for you. One, I know we live in Florida. Sometimes you have to buy bottled water. I get that. Don't buy spring water. Just don't buy the bottled spring water. I promise you it's not better. As a matter of fact, one of Nestle's plants is up near Madison Blue Spring. That is the most polluted spring in Florida. So if you buy bottled water, there's a good chance that you are drinking from the most bottled spring water, the most polluted spring in Florida, right? Buy what you got to buy. You know, to me, you bring a water bottle wherever you go, but I know we have to have bottled water. It's Florida, but don't buy spring water. Again, you know, it has 500, 600 times the impact of just buying regular bottled water. And obviously, you know, if you can drink tap. The second thing is, I showed you the urban fertilizer numbers. You know, Gainesville is another place where urban fertilizer is an issue. If you can, don't fertilize your yard. If you have to, make sure you're using slow release fertilizer. Make sure that you're not fertilizing during the rainy season. A lot of people have yard companies. You know, you all may not have yards at all anymore, but tell your kids, tell anyone, the urban fertilizer is just killing us. I mean, you look at 27% Evolutia Blue. You know, there's certain areas of the state where we got to choose between, you know, green yards and blue springs. And it's a lot harder to get the springs back than it is your yard. And real quick, they asked me to talk about the 2023. How am I doing? Yeah, good. The 2023 legislative session in Tallahassee. As you all probably know, Florida, we're still kind of have a legislative system designed for a small, rural, agriculturally based state. So our legislature meets for 2 months a year, which is what they do in Wyoming. All the other major states have year-round legislatures, more or less, or at the very least multi-year terms. We don't. We have 2 months to get everything done in a state of 22 million people, which means very, very little actually happens. 2011 was my first year working in this. They talked a lot about that in the last presentation. That was a terrible year. This year is worse. This is the first year that's worse than 2011. And I think it's just because there's so much less left to destroy, especially the big focus this year is on growth management. So in 2011, 2010, before that, Casey talked about DCA. We had this real robust state land planning agency. In 2011, they got rid of that. And they said, we're returning control to the locals, home rule, power to the people. Well, that didn't go as well as they wanted. So now they're taking, without replacing what they had at the state level, they're removing the local control. So a bill that's most likely going to pass will say there are no more local ordinances and resolutions. So no one in Florida will ever again be able to vote on a local land use issue. That will be outlawed. There's another bill that probably won't pass, but that's concerningly far, which would have removed every local environmental ordinance in the state, just preempted them straight out. Any ones that had been in place would have just been wiped out. That's a bill I'm sure we'll see again. There's a bill that's almost definitely going to pass that will make it so if you want to sue a developer over an illegal development and they win, you have to pay all of their attorney fees, which is basically going to make legal challenges impossible to go. There's a bill to use phosphogypsum, which is in some cases radioactive in roads across the state, even though it's not allowed by EPA. Not a great idea. There's one water bill this year that is okay. It's not a great bill. It's not a bad bill. It's still in negotiation. I hope we're going to be able to support it when it's done. But we are seeing a little bit of progress. But in general, it's been a very hard session environmentally and otherwise, I think, for a lot of people's values. And it's just very hard to work in the Capitol these days. I think the thing that's been most disappointing is when I started doing this, you're advocating for good water or growth laws. You would have the Democrats and some reasonable Republicans, and you kind of could put together a team to get stuff done, or at least fight off the worst stuff. And then it really became just the Democrats. And, you weren't really winning anything, but you were at least kind of, putting your finger in the dam. And this year we've kind of even lost the Democrats. So, a lot of these terrible land use bills are passing through committees with unanimously, with all the Republicans and the Democrats voting in favor of them. And it's just the way that the power dynamic is in Tallahassee right now. But there's really not a strong constituency left to protect our environment or our growth management. And I think that especially Governor DeSantis has done a wonderful job of selling his environmental work. I think he does a much better job with the PR of it than actually getting things done on the ground. This is an enormous issue. Right, they're giving almost $1 billion to Everglades right now, and it's not working. Springs are only getting $50 million a year, and that's not working. The only real answer if they want to do this is regulation, and that's a word that they're not willing to consider. So everyone would rather just pretend like all the money that we're spending is actually making a difference than looking at the science and what's going on at the ground. And I think no matter what political party you're from, if you're given a choice of just everyone's saying we're fine, look at all this money we're spending, it's a lot easier to just be part of that narrative than to be one of the few legislators out there. And there are a few who are, speaking the truth, doing good votes, standing up in committees. But we had just another story, the Secretary of the Department of Environmental Protection, who's the one responsible for these laws that's not being implemented, had his confirmation hearing. So I met with the Senate Democratic staff and I gave a whole bunch of questions to their members about these exact issues that I'm talking about today. We can disagree on some things, but we should all be able to agree that the state agencies have to follow the law. I mean, when it comes to the harm rule, this isn't even about interpretation. 8 years, they just have not done it by their own acknowledgement. Not one Republican or Democrat on the committee would even ask a question of Secretary Hamilton. Not even ask a question. They just waved him through, told him what a great job he did, and confirmed him. And, I don't think he's a bad guy by any means. He's probably a very good guy. But when our state agencies aren't following the law and our legislature refuses to have any oversight, it puts us in a situation as citizens where all we can do is sue, which is where we've been. But that's really not the way it should be. And, it makes me not want to work in the legislature very much, because you work for 3 years to pass a bill, and then the state agencies can just decide that they're not going to implement the bill. And it kind of makes you, wonder what the point of those folks we send up to Tallahassee to supposedly represent us are. Because I thought we did at least ask a question. But that's just where we're at now, is where, no one really wants to rock the boat and disturb the narrative that, that slide that shows all the nitrogen going up. I mean, that's the truth. That's the numbers. Everything else is just the narrative. Yeah, thank you all very much. I'm happy to take any questions, and yeah.
The graph that you had on nitrogen that showed Post Springs showed a very strong upward incline or upward trend. Post Springs is part of the High Springs community, as I recall. When I first arrived here around 1990, I used to swim there, but I sure don't want to swim in it now. But anyway, isn't that mostly impacted by septic tanks?
No, I mean, it's got a larger impact, but agriculture is still the predominant.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah.
All of the Santa Fe, it's about 70% agriculture overall.
In Post Springs.
Mm-hmm.
Bob Knight did show an analysis of nitrogen levels in bottled water and compared that with treatment plants with municipal water, of which GRU is very low. And these bottled waters are all uniformly at just approaching some boundary level, except for some of them, which are far above.
Mm-hmm.
I have a neighbor who drinks only bottled water. And when I tried to tell her, I mean, she's a friendly neighbor, when I tried to tell her that bottled water is not subject to the same strict standards by EPA for drinking water, she got mad at me. But her, recycle bin on the street is still full of plastic bottles. And I walk every morning, including the morning when trash pickup is made. And it's not quite uniform, but I would say the majority of households are drinking bottled water. It blows my mind, having been married to a water engineer who was very vocal about that issue. GRU is considered one of the best water providers in the state. And for people at Oak Hammock who are still drinking bottled water, Arthur, when we lived here, was trying to get the message across to our residents that your tap water is far better. Yes, if you're not used to that slight taste of chlorine in the water, you'll get used to it. You won't taste it anymore, but that's the signal that your water is safe. Anyway, end of lecture. I had an experience with the legislature too. I was speaking before the House Natural Resources Committee about water. No questions, nothing. They clearly were not interested, except one woman representative from Miami said, "Why are we paying a tax on our tap water?" And other people on the panel said, "That's the cost of delivering water to your tap. It's not a tax." But that's the level of information and understanding that our legislatures have. It's not a good system, and this term limits, as you pointed out, is a really bad idea, and we were warned before we had that opportunity. As well as ignoring the law, the legislature also ignores the constitutional amendments that people get together and pass. They don't have to pay attention to that until they're sued.
They've got a
maybe
great
not even
bill
then.
this year that would allow you to repeal anything in the Constitution with a 50% plus one vote, even though they want to make it 67% to get something passed. What's great is we could repeal the whole Constitution with 50% plus one if they pass that law. And someone might actually, but I mean, that's how wild they are now. They're not really thinking through the things, but it is, the loss of policy experts. There's not anyone elected in the building up there who understands water issues. I mean, most of these people, when I go into lobbying meetings, they have never seen a spring, never heard of a basin management action plan, don't know what significant harm means. I mean, it's just completely new vocabulary to them. And that makes it very difficult because I'm the only lobbyist in the state that works on springs issues from the good side. But, there's 30 or 40 people who work for regulated industries, and it's hard for me to compete when, it's really a knowledge battle up there.
As I pointed out last week in my talk, the whole history of Florida water management has been one of crisis response. So we are going to have to, in order to get some really strong legislation that's implemented as a regulatory response, the legislators are going to have to see bad water coming out of their taps. Yeah. And it happens. I mean, look at Jackson, Mississippi, Flint, Michigan. That's what they're going to have to see in their own homes before they'll act. Anyway, we have a hand up from Pat Harden on the Zoom. You know Pat?
Oh, yeah.
Can we talk to Pat?
Hi, Ryan.
Hey, Pat.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. One comment about the bottled water. I had occasion a number of years ago to test bottled water from various sources for about a year. And if you knew how many of them came back positive for fecal coliform, you'd change your mind about the safety of bottled water. So that's just a comment for those who think they're drinking safe water.
Well, if that doesn't do it, nothing I say will. Good Lord.
First, they have to know what fecal coliform is.
Well, it can cause you some very, shall I say, lower GI distress. And it is definitely not something that you want to be deliberately consuming every day in your water. Some strains are more virulent or more apt to cause disease than others, and you've read about it in some foods that they've recalled, that they have coli bacteria, sometimes salmonella. But anyway, your drinking water will test with far less, if any, fecal coliform than some of your bottled water, at least back then, and I don't think the practices have changed much.
Thank you, Pat. Any questions from our room audience here, the auditorium? Richard?
I'm just, every time I come to these lectures, I become more cynical. And I just can't find a way to fix it. It's not just the Florida legislature, it's the Tennessee legislatures. We seem to be going astray. And I just try to look for a positive venue, and it just is so debilitating that our government is out of control. I mean, what you say about agencies deciding, well, okay, we don't want to really, the law was passed, but we can be ignored, and have to only sue. It's just, how do you keep going with so much of a terrible negative outcome? More power to you, but it's the world is becoming very cynical, I think, of politicians and the whole process, and nobody seems to be in control. I commend you for being continually positive, but how do you do that?
Well, I mean, it's two things. One is, I'm just so lucky to have this job of all the jobs a person can have. I went back to UF at 30 after a whole nother career with I really honestly wanted to work for the water management districts. That's what I went to grad school hoping to do. And by the time I came out, they weren't places where my viewpoint was going to be received well. So I decided to go the nonprofit route, and I love what I do. The second thing is, and I think this is where the Florida Springs Council specifically is making a difference. The courts were seen as not a real avenue for change in Florida, to the point where most of the environmental groups had given up. They had given up on filing lawsuits because they do nothing but lose. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why that is. And part of it is you have to go through what's not a real court, something called the Division of Administrative Hearings, which is a fake court with fake judges. And they get to decide the first crack on these cases. And they are not good, in my opinion. I don't think we get good outcomes from them. What has been reassuring is that we've won twice unanimously in the First District Court of Appeals. Every judge that we've had was appointed by Governor Scott or DeSantis. So these are all very conservative judges. And when you have a clearly written law in a state agency that isn't going to follow it, there is a place to go. And it's the First District Court of Appeals. And we're having success there. And I'm hoping that we'll see, we're a small group, to be filing these challenges. And we have 3 employees. We have, more lawyers on our Seven Springs case than we have employees. Some of these larger nonprofits that have, tens of millions of dollars, if they started rededicating themselves to the court system, and I'm hoping that we're showing that there is a real venue there and a way to success. And, me and my, one of my board members, we'll say, we'll know when we're successful. We're beginning to get there because we've done it once, but we'll know when we're successful when we don't have to file the lawsuit. When just the threat of us showing up and saying, we're going to sue you and we're going to win, is enough to get folks to back off. And, we're spending, very large sums of money on lawyers and fees, and everything in court is incredibly expensive. And we have some great pro bono lawyers too, and it's still incredibly expensive. But, we need victories. We just need concrete victories to show people that there is some possible path to make a change. And I really feel like before our victories, it was all kind of foreclosed. There really was nowhere to go. So that's what makes me hopeful. That's why, we're going to spend a lot of our time focusing on, we have these very, very bright targets where the state hasn't followed the law, and we have a court where, it's going to take us a couple of years. When we get the issue to the court, they will look at the issue rationally and make the right decision. And they seem to be above political interference, at least on our environmental issues. So, that gives me some hope to keep going. And, again, we're the only group that's really in this niche right now that's still going hard in state court. So we're just going to try to do all we can.
Oh, Bob.
Oh, but Ryan, what can we do? Besides shoot ourselves?
Yeah, don't do that.
I have written to the legislators that you just get a form letter back. Is that helpful at all? Is there an appeal at the national level to the EPA? Can national standards override state standards? And is there some resource or recourse there?
I'll take them backwards. So at this point, pretty much everything has been preempted to the state. So EPA, when it comes to water, wetlands permitting, the state has all of it. So there really is no recourse at the federal level. What can folks do? It really comes down to, there's 2 areas, right? One area is your personal choices. I'm going to guess most people in this room make pretty good personal choices. But, don't drink bottled water, don't fertilize. If water, we use about half our water to water our lawns. It's kind of a silly thing. You water your lawn and then you cut the grass and you throw it away. It's kind of a dumb thing. So, there's just the basic things that you can do, but that's not going to change the course. Emails and phone calls do matter. The Florida Springs Council, we're kind of a unique group. While we definitely need all the financial help we can get, we have a free membership. We don't want a monetary thing to be in between anybody, our information. So you can go to the floridaspringscouncil.org. It's a totally free membership. We don't send a lot of emails except during legislative session. because we've invested in a very fancy program that makes it super easy for you to go and call and send messages to your legislators. It is a critical mass thing. So I have had senators call me, their staff, and say, "You win, we're done." Right? You can generate 5,000 calls and emails over a day. You shut down someone's office. I've had, people have said on the dais before, I was going to vote for this bill, and then I got 5,000 calls against it, right? So, that's how fracking was killed. So it does matter. I guess the way to put it is, it's not going to make a difference every time, but if you don't do it, it'll never make a difference, right? So we like to send out those alerts. Try not to do too many of them. We try to make it so, when it's your specific legislator, right? So if Rep. Clemens, for a lot of you, if Rep. Clemens was on a committee, then we'd be, micro-targeting folks in Alachua in this area, because he's not going to really care what people from Orlando say. But if he gets enough calls and emails from his constituents, it can make a difference. It's kind of like, ask an engineer is going to tell you to build something. But, I think that the nonprofits where our state agencies have really failed, and now we're often on the wrong side of our agencies and districts, the nonprofits that are doing good work, find them and support them however you can. Everybody has a niche. If we really do legal policy and lobbying, Florida Springs Institute does science. You have local groups like Chutney Alliance that's working on a springs protection area. Our Santa Fe River does great job fighting bottlers on the phosphate mines. Just find a group that kind of matches your interest and see how you can get involved. Maybe it's writing an op-ed for them to the paper. Maybe it's a donation. Maybe it's even like serving on the board. We do tons of events, like Florida Springs Council is kind of one of our things. Like, we're out in the community every weekend if we can be, showing up to those things, anything that people have, sharing messages on Facebook. I'm not a social media person. I employ people for that. But people have Facebook fundraisers for us, which I had never even heard of, but we bring in thousands of dollars a year to help fight our legal battles off of Facebook fundraisers. Which doesn't cost anybody anything to do. If you have Facebook, you just put it up on, you designate to someone. So there really is something everyone can do, but just kind of find your niche and what you enjoy. I mean, if you have a good, strong science or policy background, we're always looking for help at FSC with that stuff. But
once I discovered how effective Florida Springs Council is, I started giving a very modest monthly amount as a sustainer, but hearing this, I'm going to increase that amount. It's important to have an organization receive a regular monthly income from this kind of source that they can depend on. I am so impressed. Any more questions from the audience? Thank you for what you do, and thank you for your energy and your dedication. Godspeed.
Again, thanks for having me.